Hello and welcome to the Reason Roundtable, where every day is Liberation Day. I'm your host, Peter Suderman, and today I am joined by my colleagues, Catherine Mingy-Ward, Nick Gillespie, and Matt Welch. Everybody say hello.
Howdy.
Hello. I follow orders.
Good job, Matt. Good job. Happy Tuesday. So on today's episode, we're going to talk about Trump's second inaugural, the TikTok ban, Joe Biden's pardons and his last days as president, and a listener question about emergency measures in the wake of Los Angeles' wildfires. But first, let's do an ad. Hey, Reason Roundtable listeners, Peter Suderman here. Are you a student looking for a transformative opportunity that supports the foundations of a free society? Reliance College invites students aged 16 to 24 to the 2025 Great Connection Seminar in Chicago from July 26th to August 2nd. This year's theme, Reason and Free Will, dives into timeless ideas from writers such as Thomas Jefferson, Ayn Rand, and Aristotle. Students sharpen critical thinking in small, dynamic groups, developing the intellectual tools needed to thrive in a free society. Outside the classroom, they'll explore Chicago's vibrant culture, touring museums, trying improv comedy, and building lifelong connections. Parents, this program equips students to think, to reason, and to act independently. Go to reliancecollege.org/reason to learn more and apply. Early registration is just $400 before March 1st, including room and board with scholarships available. Don't miss out. Visit reliancecollege.org/reason to learn more and apply. That's reliancecollege.org/reason. Okay, we're going to start with the second inauguration of President Donald J. Trump. In his inaugural speech, Trump declared that America was about to enter a new golden age. Sadly, this was not a reference to classic science fiction, but Trump did promise that we would plant an American flag on Mars. To me, Trump's inaugural weekend was a cauldron of contradictions. He promised this new golden age of Martian colonization and energy abundance, but he also wants to close America off to so much immigration, which is both the source of the country's economic dynamism and a signal of its economic success. He delivered a relatively calm and normal inaugural speech, but then followed it with a rambling, off-the-cuff gripe session about January 6th and his own political persecution. He talked about ending wars, but also about how he wanted America to retake the Panama Canal, maybe by force, I don't know. He closed a pre-inaugural rally with a performance of YMCA by the Village People, a song addressed to a young man. And Trump himself is not a young man. He's 78 years old. I don't know, maybe it was for J.D. Vance. So look, the vibe has clearly shifted, but to what? Catherine, I want to start with you. You love rockets. You are ready to make the daily commute to Mars to record the podcast. What did you, an anarchist Lady Libertarian magazine editor, make of Trump's speech? Do you feel like you're about to enter your own personal golden age here?
I do not. That is not how I feel. And, I think that the thing is that the bits I liked and the bits I hated were both so far from having clear paths to being real that I don't know how to weigh them, right? So it was like, yeah, let's go to Mars. So first of all, basically every president in his inaugural speech or in his State of the Unions has said some version of like, America is back in space, baby. You better believe it. The fact that Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk were sitting immediately behind him when he said this gives it like a little more credence, but still, they lie. They lie about going to space. If we do get to space, it probably will not really, or to Mars, it will not really be down to Donald Trump. Meanwhile, the biggest applause lines were about closing the border. That is the thing that he has the most power to do in some ways, and also seems to be very, very popular. And so, if that is what's coming first and strongest, then libertarian, anarchist lady magazine editors or whatever adjectives you gave me are unenthused.
Nick, the last time Trump was sworn in, he delivered a dark and dreary speech about American carnage. This speech, however, this time, his speech was billed in advance as something much more positive, much more unifying, but it was also dark in its own way, about crime, about immigration, about what Trump called the vicious, violent, and unfair weaponization of the Justice Department. That's a quote. It was all about the ways that America had failed, and in particular, the ways that America had failed Donald Trump. You've said in the past that you are cautiously optimistic about the Trump presidency. Did this speech bolster that optimism or weaken it?
I think Lawrence Sanchez's cleavage boosted my optimism because we're back, baby. What started with Sydney Sweeney a year or so ago, that was the shot across the bow of liberal wokeism, asexual America. But I'm kind of where Catherine is.
I want to just say we are not together. We are. I also liked America going a little more shirtless.
Like Mark Zuckerberg and Lauren Sanchez, you are not together. Yeah. And yet,
it's a bold new look for America.
Carry on.
What was good, or the general vibe that I got from the inaugural speech in that super condensed, closet of the Senate rotunda. What was kind of amazing was that, all of the living ex-presidents and Kamala Harris and Doug Emhoff and Dr. Jill, had to listen to this. That was kind of fascinating theater and whatnot. Trump's inaugural speech was pretty positive and upbeat, although also filled with lies, such as, talking about how we're finally going to get out of decline, and yet real median family income, household income, is at an all-time high. We're past what it was pre-pandemic, adjusted for inflation and things like that. So, going back to the American Carnage speech where he talked about, crime that was everywhere. And he was describing, Batman's Gotham with him in the role as Bane. It's economically, the country is not in tatters. Yet it's very important for him and his backers to believe that it is, so that he can automatically just say, oh, look at this. 2 minutes in and we're already doing better than ever. That's also true about, the invasion across the southern border, which stopped a year ago, as much as you want to call people encounters at the southern border, a part of an invasion and things like that. So what worried me more after that, because I like the optimism. I like him saying, yeah, we're going to be, America is going to do great things again, without reservation. I think that's a good attitude and vibe to bring. And I think a lot of the people in that room are ready to do that and are delivering that, whether it's Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg in various ways. I believe the CEO of TikTok was also there, which is kind of fascinating. And I'm sure we'll talk about that later. But his later speeches were kind of the old rambling Trump speeches, where he also spent a lot of time talking about renaming the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America, and all of this kind of bullshit, instead of actually focusing on the things that, from a libertarian perspective, what I want is more freedom to live how I want. And the biggest threat to that is, government spending. It's not even government regulation per se. And we heard nothing about fixing the debt, nothing about addressing the deficit. And then we had all of these, as Catherine put it, there's, a real ambivalence there of we're going to open stuff up, we're going to Mars, but, Mars, don't even think about sending your people here, and we're going to tariff your goods to hell, so mixed bag.
So Matt, Nick brought up all of the CEOs who were in the room, and I just want to, but first, before we get to that, which we are going to talk about later, I do want to talk to somebody who is newly just in the room here on the podcast, right? What's going on with that, Matt?
What's going on is I just want the world to know that in my final hours as host, I did manage to issue a blanket pardon to my entire extended family. Just throwing that out there. And ratified ERA plus as the statistic, not just ERA, because it's important to adjust for time and era. Go on.
So nothing in your kids' TikTok history will be admissible. All right. So the teasers for this speech were kind of interesting when they previewed it before the actual speech was given, because they focused on one phrase in particular. That was Trump's call for a revolution of common sense. In recent years, in American politics and discussion of American politics, we've heard a lot, I think, about the decline of common sense in American governance and leadership, from COVID-era restrictions on, playgrounds to big city crime and disorder, to the total cluelessness of the political class in California in the aftermath of the Los Angeles fires. There is this sense, I think, across the political spectrum that American governance, political leadership, that elites of all stripes, that just about everyone in charge has totally lost touch that our problems go beyond ideology and policy disagreement because our leaders have forgotten the fundamentals. Did you hear in Trump's speech any signs that common sense was on its way back?
Well, sure. I mean, he made a direct kind of nod towards that near the top of his address when he said that a radical and corrupt establishment has extracted power and wealth from our citizens. We now have a government that cannot manage even a simple crisis at home. Exaggerated maybe a little bit, especially on the radical and corrupt kind of sense of it, although they're pretty corrupt, to be honest. But I think he's attributing a lot of like Dr. Evil malice and planning to what is just sort of the banality of bureaucratic evil. Although I might amend that in the wake of how Joe Biden behaved or his handlers did in the last 5 days of his presidency, which is truly putrid and awful. But I think that resonates with a lot of people. The question then becomes, and now what? I think a lot of people invest in Trump on, it's probably, I think in some ways, the more interesting and possibly positive thing about his presidency or his fact of being in the world is that people invest their sense of I'm going to use Trump as a blunderbuss against all the ways that the elites in government and also sort of buttressed in media and academia and Hollywood or whatever have screwed the pooch over and over again. But he really is a blunderbuss, and that gets to the sort of how does this play out in action? Well, is it common sense to abolish refugees? I don't think that's common sense. I think that's going against one of the greatest of American traditions, one that was rightly pointed out to in Ronald Reagan's, what do you call those addresses when you leave? Farewell address. I got it. Farewell address. When he left the presidency, and also in his very first speech to the Conservative Political Action Conference back in 1974 or 5, Trump is embedding that and completely in a way that is already affecting thousands of people who had flights. So we're doing this one again. I don't think that's common sense. So a lot of the practical applications of what people think is a restoration of common sense is what Steve Miller or whoever has the president's ear on a specific issue will be able to write in a ChatGPT assisted executive order. So I don't have a lot of faith that an erratic and kind of impulsive executive is going to be the one who's going to deliver on those common sense things. And I just want to stress that as much as I prefer kind of the rabble, messy, populist version of Pomp and Circumstances, I kind of identify more with it as an American, to have like, America's tenor come down and sing and looking like
who's from Long Island, an Italian-American from Long Island.
We couldn't tell he was an Italian-American. I don't know what gave it away.
The 3 or 4 Z's in his last name, Matt.
It was the meatball sub that he was making while he was singing the song.
There is something kind of refreshing about replacing this sort of weary, condescending elite Pomp and Circumstances with a very kind of more like pro wrestling Pomp and Circumstance, but it's still Pomp and Circumstance, and that shit ain't American. It shouldn't be, at least. We're losing our small R Republican values, and I am not here for that, and I don't think that's a shortcut, despite some certain things, which we'll get to later on, that I tend to agree with. I don't think it's a shortcut to restoring common sense.
Okay, so instead of common sense, this was something more like common nonsense?
No.
No. No, it wasn't.
Sometimes.
Wow. We need more Kid Rock, is what
guys,
Matt is
the
saying.
first rule
Less,
of improv
Elgar and more.
No, yes, and. You do not get a yes, and.
The first rule of
from
improv
us.
is yes, and.
No.
Just say yes, and. All right.
Hell no.
So let's talk more about that specific line, because the context for the line that we're going to have a revolution of common sense was Trump's opening day salvo of executive orders, something like 100 of which, I'm not sure anybody actually has a count, but it's something like 100 of which he has signed in the initial hours of his presidency. Among other things, those executive orders relate to immigration in the southern border, to gender, to Alaskan energy production and Biden's EV mandate, to federal workforce policies about remote work and DEI, to renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. and even energy efficiency rules regarding dishwashers, shower heads, and gas stoves. If nothing else, Trump is the president of cleaner plates and more intense water pressure and better sears on your steaks. So there were so many of these orders, we cannot possibly cover them all today. But I do want to go around the panel and ask each of you to pick out one aspect of Trump's day one agenda, something he did or didn't do that you think is important. Nick, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I am following a lot of the stuff related to immigration, particularly his executive order ending birthright citizenship, I think is characteristic of what we're in for, particularly from a negative point of view. This is a direct challenge to the Constitution. He is effectively reinterpreting the 14th Amendment. And, you know, if it was bad when Joe Biden suddenly declared a constitutional amendment to the Constitution in a flurry of, you know, bizarre and imperial actions towards the end of his, you know, the last few hours in
Just
in
for
office.
listeners who don't know, you're talking about the Equal Rights Amendment, which we will discuss in a little while.
The executive order on birthright citizenship is far more extensive and expansive than people were originally led to believe, but it would essentially strip people like Kamala Harris of her citizenship if it was in effect when she was born, because it's saying that contrary to the 14th Amendment and longstanding Supreme Court law as well as lower court decisions, that anybody born here of people who are basically legal or in the country, regardless of the legal status of your parents, unless they're diplomats or criminals or in occupied territory, are American citizens. This would get rid of that. And it is supposed to, kick into high gear in 30 days. It will force a large number of people to find out what their parents' legal status was. As I mentioned, it is an absolute reinterpretation of the 14th Amendment. So it's setting up a constitutional battle down the road. And for me, it's both expected but deeply troubling.
Matt Welch, what stood out to you?
So on Joe Biden's first day in office, he signed an executive order that was called the Advancing Racial Equity and Support for Underserved Communities through the federal government, which subjected all regulations, federal agencies, and spending initiatives to the test of whether their impacts were spread equitably across racially measured populations. And it got very, very, very little press coverage at all, to the extent that it did, for the most part, with the exception of libertarian and conservative press, including ourselves. It was just sort of like, oh, pause, he did the good thing over there. And Trump signed an executive order basically reversing that. And I predict confidently that it'll get 50 times the negative response to that, which in itself, I think, is kind of telling about why it happened and why ultimately I think it was necessary. There's a sort of autopilot of, oh, we all agree that this is a right and good thing to do, that we sort of saw in the woke era, whatever we're defining that as, but maybe 2014 to 2024 in November or something along those lines, that it just sort of, hey, if we have a big thing, let's make the big thing do these sort of new programs where we replace the word kind of equality of opportunity with equity, like equality of outcomes. That was a pretty pernicious thing that Joe Biden signed. And so Trump basically undid it. It's as in a lot of his other executive orders, it's too early to tell what the possible ramifications are. There's sort of reporting requirements into it where each agency has to report on which DEI contractor was doing this and that. It could get stupid and ugly. Who knows? It's hard to say. There are hundreds of executive orders that were signed yesterday at a rolling press conference, which was kind of entertaining, I suppose, for those who watched it. But it is something that I think is important. The DEI bureaucracies within the federal government, and I think even more importantly, outside of it, this sort of like, okay, I guess we should do this now, human resources thing that happened in society, in private society over the last 10 years, to the extent where a lot of people I know who like own their own companies were subjected to sort of DEI training seminars and accusations from their own. It's sort of this insane thing that happened. So I think this was an important thing to do for having the government not engage in these types of constant micromanaging of everything, and there's knock-on effects at every federal department that this Biden executive order had. On the other hand, and so I think it sort of crystallizes this sense that there's this vibe shift in the culture and in corporate culture as well, and I think that's going to be to the good and not to the bad. The one negative thing about this that I would flag is that it's just part and parcel of this. Okay, we have the government now. We're going to change its operating system and its language now. There's this sense of if we just sort of control Leviathan in this way, it's going to be great instead of this way. And there isn't a lot of thought of maybe let's not treat government as this instrument constantly to sort of enforce our own linguistic values or something sort of pernicious about the whole project of it.
All right, so Matt is officially against the government trying to help underserved communities. Actually, I want to take Nick and Matt's answers here and combine them, because I think if you look at what Trump announced about immigration and also about DEI, there is an inherent tension there that goes to the contradictions of the Trump presidency, the second Trump presidency, as we can see it so far. And on the one hand, when Trump, I don't have the words in front of me, but when Trump said we're ending DEI in government, he framed it as a victory for merit. We're just going to hire the right man or the right woman, because I guess there's only two genders in Trump's America, right? We're just going to hire the right person for the job. And there shouldn't be all of this other kind of rigmarole, sort of selecting for certain people who get a special advantage, right? But it seems to me that there is a clear contradiction in Trump's idea, on the one hand, that we shouldn't have DEI, we should hire based on merit, but we should give advantage to people who were born in the United States, and we shouldn't let employers hire from outside. Am I crazy to see this as yet another one of the contradictions in Trump's approach to all of this stuff?
It's just where you're doing the us's and where you're doing the thems, right?
Yeah. All right, Catherine, what did you see here?
Regulatory freeze. Let's do it. So that's a thing that's happening. There have been just a bonkers amount of new regulations under Biden, over 100,000 pages in the last year. Just in 2025, he added 7,641 pages to the Federal Register just before piecing out in the beginning of January. It's a lot of pages. It's just so much regulation. As I've said before on this podcast, the best thing about the first Trump administration was all the regulations that didn't happen. By issuing a regulatory freeze, he sets us up for more regulations to not happen, which I like. It's weird because now Mick Mulvaney is basically king. The Office of Management and Budget is the choke point for all new regulations. Basically, the way the freeze works is if someone appointed by Trump or someone appointed by Trump said could do it, says the regulation is okay, then it happens. But until then, no. I don't love that from a political patronage point of view, but I do love that from a not so many regulations point of view. And I think it's also probably a good sign it's sort of paired up with a hiring freeze. That's pretty common, actually. People are going to make a big fuss about the Trump hiring freeze in the federal government, but a lot of presidents incoming do this just for a minute while they get their bearings. And the Federal Employees Union is so mad, and that's always a good sign. That just feels to me like, okay, something's going right. Here is the quote from the president of the union. "Federal employees are not the problem. They are the solution."
Wow. The final solution?
To kind of put this back into something, Peter, I think both you and Matt touched on in terms of the rule by executive order or executive action. We are in the thick of this, going back to George Bush did it a ton. Obama raised it to an art form. Trump did it, and now Biden did it, and now Trump is doing it again. And we need the synthesis, because all we're getting is thesis and antithesis. And it's just okay, well, because Congress is out to lunch. It's funny, Catherine, in one of the government worker executive orders, the federal workforce has to start showing up. That's part of it. Maybe he should do that with Congress and make them show up on a full schedule for a change. But all we're getting is this flip back and forth between two extremes. And unless there really is a consensus and it starts changing laws, we're just going to be trapped in this without any actual change other than, wait 2 years for midterms, wait 4 years for a presidential shift. It's that to me is disheartening among, some of the good things that Trump has done, which I think both Matt and Catherine have touched on.
I mean, the change is that it's just an increase, an acceleration of a longstanding thing that Nick rightly, I think, points to George W. Bush being the first kind of modern accelerant of this, is that the president gets all the more power. We become more and more of a presidential system, a kingly system, which is, again, against our Republican values with a small r.
Unless the king is Mick Mulvaney.
King Mick Mulvaney is fine. Yeah. There's also
No. King Mick Mulvaney is not fine. I want that to be clear.
We're kidding. There's
Lord
also this issue
Mulvaney.
of the I think CEI calls it regulatory dark matter, which is like all the things that are not quite regulations that Biden specialized in, although presidents before him used them as well. So these are like guidance documents, policy statements, all kinds of stuff, dear colleague letters, all kinds of stuff that ends up functioning very nearly as.
That's how Catherine controls all of us.
I'm sending you a dear colleague letter after this podcast, and it's, Trump in his first term actually had a requirement to maintain online portals with those guidance documents. Biden rescinded that measure, which is shocking. Again, that's the kind of thing like no one really commented on at the time, but I don't think Trump has formally restored it. I don't think he did that in the regulatory freeze, but he might do so, and that would be good. It was not fully observed during his first term, but this is important too, is we have the things Congress should be doing and it is not doing, and then many of those things are being done by regulatory agencies or within the executive branch, and then even there, they are doing a lot of quasi-legal compulsion below the level even of stuff that appears in the Federal Register.
So the thing that stood out to me was what Trump didn't do on tariffs, but what he said. So there was a line in his speech: instead of taxing our citizens to enrich other countries, we will tariff and tax foreign countries to enrich our citizens. Like I said, there were no new tariffs announced in that speech or in the first day's worth of orders, but there are reports that Trump might implement new tariffs as soon as February. And there are reports out there saying that Peter Navarro, who is a Trump advisor, who is like what Stephen Miller is to immigration, Peter Navarro is to tariffs. I mean, he is the tariff guy. That is his solution to absolutely everything. And he has apparently been telling Trump's allies to look for what he calls the External Revenue Service to be established within the Department of Congress. And he's using the line, tariffs are tax cuts for the American people. Catherine, are tariffs tax cuts?
Nope, they're not.
All right. I'm glad we've got that solved. Okay, so one thing that was different from Trump's first inaugural was who was in attendance. We've talked about this just a little bit already, but this wasn't just a party for longtime MAGA diehards like Peter Navarro and Stephen Miller. Some of the best seats at the inauguration ceremony went to tech titans Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and others. Just a few days before, Joe Biden, in his farewell address, warned about the power of tech oligarchs, who he compared to 19th century robber barons. Matt, I want to ask you, did the presence of some rich guys at Trump's inaugural validate Biden's warning? What do we make of Biden's farewell and what it says about his presidency, just the overall state of the Democratic Party?
Biden's farewell address is a fitting capstone to his very mediocre to lousy presidency. It was an attempt to kind of like pull out references to two of the more kind of famous presidential exertions in the past, the famous Eisenhower farewell address talking about the military-industrial complex, whose the meaning of that speech Biden appears to have totally slept on, including about the military-industrial complex, which hasn't gone away, has it? Did it go away? Do we have a Cold War? Wait a second. So it was tawdry, but it wasn't quite as tawdry as what then came after in the last couple of days of Biden. No, it was a petulant. They're now going on the bad team. We don't like that. His farewell address, he talked about fact checking on Facebook. This is the state of the Democratic Party. That, and they propped up an old guy that everyone knew was old, and like, screw it, we're going to lie about it to the American people for a long time. The state of the Democratic Party, the party that, by the way, Joe Biden was thinking as a finalist for his vice presidential pick as late as August of 2020, Karen Bass. So that's how the talent picking has gone. And then Kamala Harris won, who is actually kind of worse than Karen Bass, but at least more qualified.
Neither, to be clear, are part of the common sense revolution.
They are not. The word revolution needs to be retired. But no, it was an awful address. I don't like, and we've talked about it here on this podcast in the past, I don't like ring kissing in general. I'm sure a lot of people are having fun. Elon Musk is making grand gesticulatory movements with his hands and hopping up and down. And, I don't want to be small-minded in the face of people enjoying their celebratory moment. But forgive me for not being super excited. One of the things that Donald Trump said in his speech, one of his executive orders, is we're going to rename Mount whatever the hell it was renamed to Mount McKinley I missed that memo back then because William McKinley was so great at doing tariffs and making America great. One of the underappreciated things about Grover Cleveland, who was the anti-William McKinley and who was the previous I can't talk. I'm a panelist now, Nick. I can filibuster all I fucking want.
I was just going to say that Grover Cleveland was possibly fatter than William McKinley.
Taft, thankfully.
That was Trump. The thick years for the U.S. presidency.
The thicks and mustaches.
That's why they named a mountain after him.
The Trump second term is going to make the corruption of the Trump first term look like a piker in comparison, I predict. I mean, we're going to look back at the Trump Hotel as being like a quaint little... They really had a hotel called the Trump Hotel, like adjacent to the White House. Like, that's normal. We're doing meme coins now. There is corruption associated with all this. There is ring kissing, and that's bad. Biden's petulant, rearguard defense of his own sensorial industrial complex is absolutely tawdry, and it tells us that the modern Democratic Party still hasn't learned from its lesson that you can't censor your way into popularity.
I don't want those guys to want to be there, though. That's the issue, right? Like, if they're there or they're not there, I don't care, kind of on its own terms. But it should not be true that those people who are some of the people who command incredible resources, who are really smart guys, who are like creative forces in our economy, would think, yes, the best use of my time is to stand beside and behind Donald Trump and smile like an idiot. Like, that's for Chris Christie. That's not for these guys, And I think that it does speak to ultimately their fear, right? Like, some of them have convinced themselves that they like him. Some of them are just there kind of as hostages. But they know that the American president has the power to destroy them or force them to do whatever within their own companies. We saw that in the Twitter files. We saw that in the Facebook files. And we will continue to see it because Trump is going to keep doing it. And they've decided that their best bet is to kiss the ring, is to suck up. And that is not a healthy situation.
I mean, this has just been the story for the last several decades, especially with big tech. Microsoft famously was like, we don't need a presence in Washington in the 1990s, and then got hit with one of the biggest antitrust suits in modern history and decided, actually, wait, we need a huge presence in Washington. And a lot of the young tech guys learned from that experience, and I think also have learned from the last several years of just being attacked by Democrats, by Elizabeth Warren and her staff, which basically was the Biden presidency. That is an exaggeration, but it is an exaggeration with a real hint of truth. To the extent that Biden was not acting as president, it was a lot of Warrenites and people in her orbit who were his top staffers who were running things. And that scarred the tech industry. And they are not going to let that happen again, especially now that they see that there is an opening. Nick, I want to ask you something here about, I want to relate this to something else, right? So Biden's war warning was that the new tech oligarchs are a threat to our democracy. And over the years, Biden has lobbed this charge often at Donald Trump, right, who he has portrayed as a kind of lawless authoritarian. But just minutes before Trump took the oath of office, Biden preemptively pardoned a bunch of people in his family. And a day or two before Donald Trump was sworn into office, he also pardoned Anthony Fauci, Mark Milley, right? And so this is despite Biden having said that he would not make last-minute pardons as president. What do you think of these pardons? And then compare them to what Donald Trump also did on his first day, which was a mass pardon of people convicted in January 6th prosecutions.
Yeah, and as of this taping, he has not yet commuted the sentence of Ross Ulbricht, which he promised to do, which is disturbing. I think you have to start looking at Joe Biden as kind of, David Lynch died last week. He's like a David Lynch character where his consciousness, it just exists as like still photographs that are not related to one another at all. He's like Dr. Manhattan or something. He is simultaneously all things to all people in all places and in all timelines. I wish that Joe Biden had preemptively pardoned all of the Trump family members. I think that would have been a great thing, but Joe Biden just isn't there. It's disturbing as hell, and it should be an outrage to everybody. The way that Biden acted throughout his presidency, he was mediocre at best, as Matt suggested. He was terrible at worst, and he was terrible for American industry. And it's the business of America isn't necessarily business, but Joe Biden at every opportunity said, okay, you can either, we can either have slightly more free markets or slightly less free markets. And he always went left. He was like Earl Monroe or something like that. Terrible on that score. And then he really jumped into a different category altogether where he's starting to lie about stuff like, pardoning Hunter, pardoning his family, saying that the Constitution is amended because I declare it so. And Kamala also went along with that. This is like disturbing stuff. And what is unfortunate about it is that it opens up the door a little bit more for Trump to do something similar. I find that, disturbing. I think many of the January 6th people who were arrested deserve to have their sentences commuted and perhaps pardons. I think there's a range of people there, but the kind of actions that Trump has been taking so far don't make me feel like, okay, what we have done is we've learned the lesson of the Biden interregnum, and now we're going to go back to, a truly Republican form of government, small form of government, and where our leaders matter less and less, so that the heads, the tech oligarchs don't feel like they need to be in the room, because otherwise the ones in there will conspire against them. And if I may, about Biden's farewell speech, I think the warning about oligarchy is wise. It's always wise. One of the things that, the most interesting guy in that room actually was the person that Trump in his first term used to refer to as Tim Apple, the head of Apple, because he couldn't remember his name. This is a guy who defines the kind of tech Silicon Valley woke progressive left. Apple was one of the first companies to grant benefits to gay and lesbian partners, things like that. He's there not because he likes everything about Trump. He's there because the regulatory regime that was under Joe Biden, coming out of Elizabeth Warren, and the kind of the hipster antitrust people, the neo-Brandeisians, was terrible for their business. And we should all be glad in a way that the tech oligarchs are there, not because their agenda is our agenda always, but because they want less regulation. And all of them have made our lives so much better. I mean, it's like, imagine the past, 5 years without Amazon. Imagine the pandemic without Amazon. That would be a much, much poorer country in every possible way.
We are going to get to TikTok and the whether or not tech makes our life better in just a little bit. But Catherine, Nick mentioned the one other big thing that Biden did before he left office. He certified the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, which is meant to guarantee that all Americans have equal rights and protections under the law, regardless of sex. He said it's part of the Constitution and should be considered the law of the land. So you're a lady. Do you have equal rights now? Do you feel constitutionally protected?
I have always felt protected by the Constitution. I love the Constitution. The ERA has nothing to do with nothing, and it is not the law of the land now, as many, many people, absolutely everyone who knows what they're talking about, agrees. You gotta have 38 states for ratification, and we don't. The deadline passed, and then some states withdrew. It's not there. It's not there. All Biden did was say, I like the ERA. And that's fine, but it's not the law of the land. And it's, it's almost like he just went on this little campaign to be sure that any high ground that kind of partisan Democrats were holding as we slid into the very end of the Biden administration was lost. Because he was just like, real quick, let me just try to do some obviously unconstitutional stuff. Let me do a bunch of really, really kind of corrupt looking pardons. I'm not going to enforce a TikTok ban. And then we hopped right over to Trump, who was like, okay, I'm going to do a bunch of unconstitutional stuff. I'm going to do a bunch of corrupt looking pardons, and I'm not going to enforce the TikTok ban. It's the same. Like, oh, it's so bad. Anyway, I'm a lady, and I do not think the ERA is the law of the land.
All right, let's take a break for a minute. We're going to stop talking about the ERA and instead talk about IRAs. Are you being lied to? They tell you to max out your 401k and IRA, and then they make you beg for permission to use your own money. It's time to get the truth and discover a better way to grow and protect your money. Bank on Yourself is the proven retirement plan that alternative banks and Wall Street desperately hope you never hear about. It gives you tax-free retirement income. You'll know your tax rate in retirement is 0 under current tax law, which protects you from the coming tax tsunami. You are in control. You get access to your money for emergencies and opportunities with no questions asked. There are no government penalties or restrictions on how much or when you can take it. And when you use your money, it keeps growing like you never touched it. Try doing that with a 401k or IRA. You can't. You can get a free report that reveals how you can bank on yourself and enjoy tax-free retirement income, guaranteed growth, and control of your money. Just go to bankonyourself.com/roundtable to get your free report. That's bankonyourself.com/roundtable, bankonyourself.com/roundtable. Okay, this week's listener question comes from Tommy, who lives in Altadena, California, where I know we have a number of listeners, including at least one who wrote in to tell us about losing his house. I'm just so sorry to hear that, but thank you for listening and for writing. So Tommy writes, I saw the column against curfews this morning. Reason.com published a column about how curfews were a problem. Tommy says, I don't really have the patience for broad arguments like that at the moment. Maybe my principles are weaker than I thought. Or maybe highly dynamic situations sometimes need temporary blunt force to contain greater harms. My house was nearly looted, but a holdout neighbor tased one of them trying to break in. Cops arrested guys driving on my block who had already made it up to burnt-out homes, snatched their fireproof safes from the rubble. Honestly, Tommy says, I am okay with the trade-off of basically stopping everyone from moving around after dark when they're more likely than not to be bad actors. His question is, where do you draw the line or lines in chaotic situations? What are your trade-offs between freedom of movement and protection of property? Matt, you are our resident California guy and curfew hater. What do you think of this?
So shout out to Tommy, shout out to listener Greg who lost their home, shout out to the bass player and drummer of the theme song of this podcast who both lost their homes in the Altadena fire, the Eaton fire in Altadena. Terrible, terrible stuff. I hate curfews so much that it makes my nose turn green, which is really hard when your nose is as red and swollen with drink as mine is. The first time I heard the word curfew, I wanted to strangle somebody, which I believe is in Winchell's Donut Shop, Nick, in Long Beach, California at 10:30 p.m. on a school night. So I get the libertarian aversion to it. I think I wrote very early during the pandemic about a curfew in New York, and it wasn't in favor of it. I nonetheless mostly agree with listener Tommy in this case, because there's a difference between a curfew that affects people who live in their own home. Don't tell me I can't go out. I cannot currently imagine a situation in which I agree with that curfew. There are different types of curfew when you say, see this neighborhood over here, which is unsafe, where there's fires, and also after dark there are people looting, and I'm trying not to cuss Fred Young about the people who are doing that. And I know a lot of people who've been in similar situations. Their neighbor with a taser or with a hose or with some blunt force weapon saved their safe from these despicable people who are going up in Altadena and trying to loot. It's just awful. I think that's different. There's so many first responders trying to set a perimeter around a dangerous area. I think that's a different situation than saying that you can't go outside of your home. So I understand that type of curfew, if that really is the right word for it. I think it's more like this is a security perimeter around a dangerous area. And I think government in those situations should be part of the toolkit if necessary. And when there's a bunch of rat bag looters, then I guess sadly it becomes necessary.
Catherine, Nick, do either of you have a different opinion about this?
I just wanted to point out real quickly that the curfew talk in America is usually about curfews for kids. Teenagers and things like that. And those empirically don't work. We've written about that over the years, and the sociologist Gary Allen Fine has talked about that. I'm with Matt that in certain very limited, clearly demarcated emergency situations, when you have curfews, I think that is legitimate where you limit movement. But the key is that it has to be an actual emergency situation, and it has to be clearly time limited, so that it does not become some kind of pretext for just hassling people all the time. But, and I suspect Catherine will disagree with this a bit, but this might be one of the lines between a kind of, I don't want to say state capacity libertarian versus anarchist perspective, but it might be that it's like, there are times when there are legitimate reasons for temporary periods to limit people's freedom, as long as it's done in a constitutionally consistent way.
Catherine, you're an anarchist. I assume you're just very excited for the neighbor with the taser.
I do love the neighbor with the taser. Mad props to the neighbor with the taser. And I think the neighbor with the taser actually is the answer here, right? The temptation to use curfews is, I understand it. I doubly understand it in the situations where Nick and Matt are willing to make these kind of exceptions. However, we just had a president declare coupled 4 national emergencies on a variety of fronts. I think we all remember COVID, in which curfews were declared willy-nilly, lockdowns, all kinds of orders. And I simply think that empirically the use of curfew power on average is a horrific abuse of power. If there was a great and awesome world in which we could only use a teeny little curfew at exactly the right time, maybe we don't live in that world. And even in the case of this, this horrible situation with the wildfires, there were a lot of first responders. There were a lot of law enforcement officers out and about. And I think we should absolutely go after people who break into people's houses. That's already illegal. You don't need a curfew for that.
All right. So Nick mentioned children, which brings us to our next topic. We're going to do a quick round on TikTok. During President Trump's first term, he pushed for a ban on the popular social video platform. Nothing happened while Trump was in office. But last year, a TikTok ban was passed by Congress and signed by President Biden. And after unanimous approval by the Supreme Court, after a challenge, that ban went into effect. Over the weekend, late on Saturday night, TikTok was taken offline, and it's maybe coming back online. Biden said he would leave enforcement of the ban to President Trump, and Trump, of course, has since reversed himself. He no longer wants to ban TikTok. In fact, he now wants to save TikTok. This goes to what I was saying earlier about Trump's second term looking like a bunch of self-contradictory impulses. So, Nick, I actually want to ask you about the U.S. government's argument to the Supreme Court here. What the government basically said was that the TikTok ban was legal and justified because of data collection concerns. Basically, TikTok collects a lot of data on Americans. We don't even know exactly what kinds. But TikTok's parent company, ByteDance, is a Chinese company, and ByteDance is potentially subject to Chinese government demands to turn over customer data, which would mean on Americans. There's not a lot of evidence that it is happening, but in theory, it could. So the worry is that an authoritarian foreign government could gain access to massive amounts of data about Americans. I know, Nick, that you oppose the ban on free speech grounds, but think about this in the context of, say, Edward Snowden, who revealed that American intelligence agencies were working through private companies to collect a lot of data on Americans. And there was a lot of libertarian concern about that. How do you reconcile your support for TikTok not being banned with your concerns about data collection by governments, even American governments?
Yeah, for the starting point, and by the way, Grindr went through this in 2018, 2019. It had to be sold.
Also for the children?
Yeah, especially for the children just weren't getting on it enough, I guess. But it's a much smaller outfit. We're talking about a social media platform that has 170 million Americans have accounts or have used it. The data has been sequestered on Oracle servers and things like that. So ByteDance has already distanced itself where the data is not being served. And this, to me, is the case. If we were at war with China, if there was demonstrated harms that were being done, as opposed to very, very theoretical ones that you have a bunch of, government spooks coming and saying this could be really bad. We're the guys who lied to you about all of the things the U.S. government was doing to you. But now you better trust us that China is really bad and we need to do something about this. I just think that's, it's a bullshit argument. And then when you press people on that, where, okay, there's no demonstrated harm. And if the data is actually sequestered, okay, then they don't have access to that. And it's not clear what that data would do. People start saying things like, well, just like with Grindr, it's going to, make homosexuals subject to blackmail requests. It's going to, people's HIV statuses are going to become public. I mean, all of these bizarre scenarios, none of which have come to fruition, but we're supposed to believe that, or then China is going to start, manipulating the feed in TikTok in order to make sure that everybody in America believes this or that. We are not that far out of 2016 and the freak out and moral panic over Cambridge Analytica and all of that, which has shown time and time again that social media, even if it's trying to, just does not have that effect on public opinion. It seems to me on every level, this is just bullshit. The one good thing about Trump is that, he reversed his position on it, but then he most recently has floated, and who knows if he knows what he's talking about, an idea where the U.S. government would own 50% of TikTok, which is even more insane than just letting it die almost. So
can't Trump buy it now with his meme coin earnings?
Yeah, and that the Village People dance that he broke out.
New TikTok CEO Barron Trump. At age 18. I'm looking forward to all of it.
Matt, this actually goes to my question to you, which is that I gather that you're on TikTok, right? You're doing a lot of dance moves. You got several alts, I assume. Yeah.
You outed yourself as not being the father of a 16-year-old girl.
This is my question. I think you have a chronic case of secondhand TikTok exposure.
Secondhand?
Thanks to your kids.
There is
right?
a texting mechanism on telephones, so secondhand it is not. I've seen many breakdowns already of Melania's haberdashery sent from my teen.
But this is the panic. I mean, You hate communists. How do you feel as a parent about the Chi-Coms raising your kids here through a video app?
It was a really interesting 3 hours on Sunday. I'll say that. Those golden 3 hours when we have the TikTok ban and watching this child have to try to interact with her family members whilst on holiday in Miami, Florida. It was very, very funny. I think that social media and technology and phones were all a mistake. And that for all you parents out there, hold the line for as long as you can. It was very difficult with my 16-year-old's generation because of COVID. But the 9-year-old, she's screwed. She is not getting a phone ever for her entirety of her life. I don't think that outsourcing parenting to the whims of whatever the president feels like interpreting on a law is really the way we're going to get out of this. And I've never really been convinced by some of the arguments, and I've heard like attempts at some of the better elements of them, of like what the Chi-Coms are going to do. Like, are they going to press a button and my dumb 16-year-old becomes even dumber? It's kind of hard to imagine, first of all, but like, what are they going to do?
They're going to gain control of Donald Trump's Diet Coke button.
I think
it's right. They're going to hack the Diet Coke button, and who knows what's going to be in the Diet Coke.
It's been a really, really ominous week, the last 5 days, let's say, for those apparently vanishing few of us who were serious when we talked about norms and like the text of laws and like the Constitution and stuff. I don't like the TikTok ban. I think it's ridiculous. However, it was passed into law, and then the Supreme Court upheld it, I guess, in a sort of limited way, but 9-0. The president can't just like say, nah, just kidding, and then making it an applause line for all the people who voted for it at his various inaugural events. There is something kind of sick. We are now investing all of this potential power, right? This whole week started with, as Catherine was alluding to before, like, this we're going to tweet out this thing, and now it's part of the Constitution from Biden. Then you have the TikTok thing that happens, and then there's the preemptive pardons that go back to like family members you haven't even heard of yet on the Biden part, and then Trump pardons convicted violent criminals who did the violence against people who didn't deserve to be violenced on during January 6th. Pardoned them, 8 days after J.D. Vance said, well, of course we're not going to pardon any of the violent people. Trump also trying to amend the Constitution, not by tweet, but by executive order when it comes to birthright citizenship, which is 14th Amendment. The Constitution, all of this is just really, really bad on basic rule of law reasons. So I see it in light of that, and we are in a kind of bad place right now as a country. We've forgotten that there is legislature. We've forgotten about the separation of powers. People are really, 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 really excited about what the pen and the phone can do, of weeks after, being critical of what the pen and the phone can do. So I don't agree with the TikTok ban. And I don't agree with the president just sort of like, hey, we're going to enforce the law this way or that way, depending on whatever I feel like doing this morning.
Just because I know we will get a listener writing into us to explain this to us, there is a provision in the TikTok ban law that says that the president can suspend operations or enforcement of that law for 90 days, provided that there is clear evidence or something like that there is a divestment happening. But there's not really evidence that that's happening. And so Trump's decision to suspend enforcement for 90 days doesn't really seem to actually fit into the law. Okay, so we have talked all about what's happening in America. Let's talk about what's happening in our own eyeballs. Let's go to our final segment, What You Watchin'. Catherine Mangue-Ward, let's start with you.
This doubles as a mental health check for me because I am rereading Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson. That's where I am, just as a person, as a journalist. And I'm doing that in part because Peter Suderman reminded me on a recent podcast that it contains references to my new favorite Sumerian goddess. So that was pretty fun.
Did you have an old favorite Sumerian goddess?
No, but I had old favorite goddesses, and now I'm Mesopotamian. Anyway, it is a good thing to read right now because, among other things, there is a kind of attenuated version of the U.S. federal government that exists as part of a kind of chaotic, polycentric legal world. And everything is very dark and everything is very bad. And also everything is very technologically exciting. And it's kind of okay, ? And that's the energy that I'm bringing in to 2025.
Matt Welch, what have you been watching?
I attended for the first time in my life the Frost Science Museum in Miami, Florida. Very, very nice science museum. It's got an aquarium bit. It's got a nice planetarium, bunch of stuff, just sort of modern, and it's in Miami, and Miami is super great. And I'm not sure why I don't live there. But they have a special exhibit right now called Bugs. And Catherine, you got to go to Bugs.
Wait, what's it about?
Gotta go. It's about bugs, Peter. It's done in connection with like the New Zealand Museum of, I don't know, Science or Bugs. But the highlight of it, it's really great to go with kids, and I went with mine, is there are like half a dozen of these kind of like, imagine sort of an igloo made out of polyurethane sort of plastic. It's not an igloo, but it's the shape, the round thing. And then you enter through one side, and then suddenly you've got like a 6 foot tall praying mantis that suddenly goes at you, and then they sort of explain.
How did you make that noise?
It's the beard. It has its own oral capabilities.
Is that beard what, an insect that like grabbed onto you and is now
it's a mandible
merging with you?
It is mandibles. But just like terrific and crazy. And there's a bunch of other things besides, but it's in those little kind of bug igloos with gigantic Japanese bees and horrible cockroaches doing cockroach things. Just fantastic and wacky and filled with kids everywhere, and love it. Frost Science Museum Bugs. Check it out.
Nick, not the bees.
I went to see the band Cracker, which was a big thing starting in the early 90s. It was founded by a couple people coming out of Camper Van Beethoven, which was a great alt rock band or college rock band. In the 80s, Cracker had big hits like Teen Angst, What the World Needs Now, Low, I Hate My Generation, and they are. The people in that are mostly boomers, but they have like just that phenomenally great alternative Gen X energy of kind of do it yourself, of recognizing that they are post idealism, but they still want to live in a fun world and a good world and a positive world. Their songs, and they've continued to record new albums well into the past few years, and they just released alternative versions of their catalog that are great, that are on Spotify. What I liked, I saw them at Sony Hall in New York City, and it was mostly an older crowd, but not completely. And they have a fiddle player now who is from Yellow Springs, Ohio, an African-American woman who's into Celtic music. And it's that kind of amalgamation of positive energy, sarcasm, irony, and forward momentum, which is what the world needs now. Because these are people who are not, pie in the sky, idiots who are just, kind of, Lee Greenwood type Americans. These are people who are reviving and extending all sorts of American musical traditions with a punch. And I hope more young people listen to them, because this is, how do you get out of Snow Crash and into something a little less gloomy, although no less compromised? I think it's by listening to bands like Cracker.
That's beautiful. So since we've been talking about the darkness and strangeness at the heart of the American experience, I figured I should talk about David Lynch, the wonderful filmmaker who died sadly last week at the age of 78. Over the weekend in mourning, I watched Eraserhead, which I hadn't seen in over 20 years, and Wild at Heart. Eraserhead is David Lynch's first film. Not quite a student film, but pretty close. And it is just a kind of strange, surrealist masterpiece, and particularly the sound design. I'd never seen it on a good sound system before. And the sound design of that movie is just incredible and legendary. He spent something like a year just putting together the soundtrack. And a big part of what he did was just layer sounds, environmental sounds that sort of heightened the strangeness and alienation of this movie, which is a black and white film about a father caring for his mutant kid in a sort of post-apocalyptic industrial wasteland. And it's just bizarre and strange, but also kind of surprisingly tender. And then you get to Wild at Heart in 1990, which is this noirish romance road movie starring Nicolas Cage. And you see so many of those elements from Eraserhead, that kind of sense of the surreal and of life being this kind of awful thing, but also beautiful and wonderful, and something that you should cherish while you have it. And he really managed to capture that kind of strange contradiction at the heart of America and it being alive. And I don't know if I want to say that he was a libertarian filmmaker, but the signature line from Nicolas Cage in Wild at Heart is about his snakeskin jacket, which is the first thing he puts on after he gets out of prison for killing someone in a way that in the movie's presentation is in fact pretty justified as self-defense. And what does Nicolas Cage say about his snakeskin jacket? He says, "This is a snakeskin jacket. It's a symbol of my individuality and my belief in personal freedom." And that was David Lynch's legacy, was individuality and personal freedom. And he put it on screen every time he made a movie or a television show. He was a great, and he will be missed. So
if I may, the Eraserhead is one of the great inflection points in American popular culture. And it made possible so much stuff after that, not just in his own oeuvre, but that came out in 77 or 78, and I saw it in college. It would constantly be shown in midnight, madness showings or in auditoriums that people would rent.
It was a flop at first and became a hit through midnight screenings.
It is bizarre and insane and absolutely ecstatic to watch it. And I think people seeing somebody like David Lynch able to put that out into the culture, it was very much part and parcel of a low culture 70s, do it yourself, get it out there, and you can be whatever you want. And if we live in a better world, and I think we do than we did, before Eraserhead, it's because you suddenly realize you could be an individual artist and have this bizarre expression that would find a home, and not just people would watch it and kind of imbibe it, but it would spur them to go on and do what they wanted to do. It's David Lynch's, influence, I think, on popular culture was all to the good. And, it's good that we honor him, if not a doctrinaire libertarian, in every sense of the word, just a fantastic individualist who makes us all kind of smarter and more interesting just by dint of proximity.
And a fantastic American. He's just he could only exist in America, I do believe.
Nick, do you have anything you want to let us know about coming up? Events, special performances? Are you going to be hosting a midnight showing of Eraserhead soon, I hope?
No.
All right.
Sorry.
That's it. Welcome to America's new golden age and this podcast's. Thanks all. We'll see you next week.